rather than against it. A quirky tidbit from Pacific voyaging stories is that experienced sailors could sometimes predict squalls by watching the way clouds boil upward, or by noticing a sudden change in the smell of the air. Rain has a scent, and so does the wind that precedes it. Imagine being able to smell incoming rain and casually think, ah, it's not just calm, it's moving in subtle currents. The lagoon has its own circulation, shaped by tides pushing water in and out through reef gaps. The navigator listens again. Even here, sound matters. Water moving through a channel has a different sound than water moving over coral. A soft gurgle, a faint hiss, a whisper of flow. The crew paddles gently, and you can almost hear the blades cutting through water like slow breathing. You glance toward the shore. You can now make out silhouettes. Palm trees, low bushes, perhaps taller trees farther inland. The island is no longer an abstract concept. It's a physical presence. You smell it clearly now. Wet wood, salted sand, plant sap, and maybe smoke, faint but real. You can almost imagine a village somewhere beyond the trees, people sleeping under woven roofs, unaware that a canoe has just returned from the open ocean. Or maybe very aware because arrivals matter. The canoe edges closer, and you begin to understand that landfall is not just a moment of celebration. It's a technical challenge. Because reefs can be confusing. The water can look calm but hide sharp coral just below the surface. A canoe can scrape, crack, or become stuck. So the navigator watches everything. They watch the surface. They watch the reflections. They watch the direction of ripples. They watch the way moonlight, what little there is, glints differently off shallow water. Historians still argue whether navigators memorized reef passages through repeated local travel, or whether they could improvise safely even in unfamiliar lagoons by reading water patterns alone. Likely both. Familiar routes would be known, but the ability to improvise would be essential when exploring new islands. And that ability is what made Polynesian expansion possible. Because if you only know one lagoon, you can't settle a new island. You have to read the unknown. The canoe glides forward, and suddenly you see it. Pale line in the darkness. Foam. And it allowed them to ignore the reality that Polynesians had already mapped the ocean long before Europeans arrived. You imagine a European ship captain in the 1700s, arriving at an island and meeting people who clearly have sophisticated seafaring knowledge. And instead of thinking, wow, they must have traveled here intentionally, the captain thinks, ah yes, they must have washed up here by accident, because sometimes the human ego is more powerful than evidence. You sit quietly, listening to the fire crackle, and you think about how this debate played out in modern scholarship. There was a time when even academic researchers doubted Polynesian intentional voyaging. Some suggested that currents and winds could carry canoes randomly, and that settlement was the result of chance. But then came the counterargument. Polynesian cultures were too widespread, too connected, too consistent for that to be purely accidental. Languages across the Pacific share roots. Archaeological evidence shows similar tools and crops. Oral traditions speak of planned voyages, of ancestors traveling deliberately. And then, in the 20th century, experimental voyages helped prove the point. But we'll get to that soon. For now, you're sitting in the island clearing, watching people move around the fire. The scene is peaceful, almost timeless, and yet you can feel the tension of history layered on top of it. Because when Europeans arrived, they didn't just bring curiosity. They brought colonization. They brought disease. They brought new political power structures. And they brought a tendency to write down history in a way that centered themselves. A quirky tidbit, though, is that even some European explorers were quietly amazed by Polynesian navigation. Captain James Cook, for example, famously traveled with a Tahitian navigator named Tapaya, who demonstrated impressive geographic knowledge of Pacific islands. It must have felt like history itself was breathing again. Mau Pielug, the navigator who guided that voyage, was not Polynesian by ethnicity, but Micronesian. And that fact matters, because it reminds you that ocean navigation traditions were shared across the Pacific in complex ways. Knowledge traveled between islands, sometimes through direct teaching, sometimes through cultural exchange. Historians still argue about the extent to which Polynesian and Micronesian navigational systems influenced each other historically, and how much knowledge was independently developed in different regions. But modern revival voyages made one thing clear. The Pacific is not a set of isolated dots. It is a connected world, a sea of relationships. You sit there in the clearing, imagining those revival voyages. Canoes cutting through modern seas, carrying not just people but identity. The act of sailing becomes an act of cultural healing. And you realize how powerful that is. Because navigation is not just about getting from one place to another. It's about remembering who you are. A quirky tidbit. During modern wayfinding training, some apprentices still learn by spending long nights under the stars, memorizing the star compass, practicing swell recognition, and being taught to see patterns that most people ignore. Some navigators even avoid using modern tools during training so their senses don't become lazy, which is a polite way of saying they refuse to let their brain become like yours, dependent on technology. Honestly, fair. You picture a modern student lying on a canoe deck at night, staring at the horizon, trying to memorize star houses, while their phone sits uselessly in a bag. No scrolling, no distractions, just sky. And you think, that's probably the healthiest thing a human can do in 2026. The fire crackles softly, almost out now. Someone covers the embers with sand, leaving a faint glow like a sleeping eye. The clearing grows darker. But historians still argue whether early voyages were primarily intentional expeditions or partly accidental drift voyages that later became intentional once routes were known. It's likely a mix because humans are complicated, and the ocean doesn't care about your plans. Still, the sheer consistency of settlement patterns suggests purpose. You don't just accidentally end up in Hawaii multiple times, then decide to colonize it, and then somehow maintain cultural connections across thousands of miles. That would be like accidentally driving to another continent and then casually bringing your cousins over next week. So as you sit there, swaying gently in the canoe, you realize something. The Pacific isn't empty. It's full of information. You just don't speak its language yet. The navigator does. They're reading the stars, the swells, the wind, the clouds, and the behavior of birds. They're noticing patterns so subtle you would miss them even if someone wrote them on your forehead. And the thing is, it's not magic. It's skill. Skill built through memory, tradition, apprenticeship, and an almost unsettling patience. The canoe glides forward. The paddlers are quiet now because the sail has been raised. It catches the wind with a soft flap, like a giant bird stretching its wings. The sail itself looks simple, woven from pandanus leaves or other fibers. It's not shiny, not synthetic, not mass-produced. But it works. It's been working for centuries. You hear the creak of lashings. No metal nails, just rope, fiber, and technique. Traditional Polynesian voyaging canoes, like the double-hulled Wakaulua in Hawaii or the Waka Moana in other regions, are engineering masterpieces. 2 hulls for stability, a platform between them, a sail that can shift, and a structure designed to survive huge waves without snapping like a cheap pool toy. Their posture is relaxed but attentive, like a cat pretending not to care while secretly monitoring everything. They aren't just a passenger. They're a living instrument. But before you can truly appreciate the navigator, you need to appreciate the canoe itself. Because without the canoe, none of the star-reading brilliance matters. The canoe is the technology that makes the impossible possible. And it's not some crude raft barely held together with optimism. It's carefully balanced. The twin hulls provide stability. The platform gives space for cargo. The sail harnesses wind. The steering paddle, sometimes enormous like a giant wooden leaf, allows controlled movement. It's a vessel designed for endurance. You think about how long a voyage could take. Weeks, sometimes longer. That means you need food, water, and shelter from sun and rain. You need a way to store supplies without them rotting. You need fishing gear because you can't exactly stop at an ocean drive-through. The crew has baskets woven from pandanus leaves, containers made from gourds, and bundles of dried food. You see what looks like dried fish, maybe preserved breadfruit paste, and other things that smell faintly like ancient snack time. A quirky tidbit, one of those strange little details that makes history feel real, is that some Pacific voyagers reportedly carried fermented breadfruit paste, stored in pits on land before the voyage, then packed for travel. Imagine being on a canoe for 2 weeks and someone cheerfully offering you a scoop of fermented breadfruit like it's a gourmet treat. You would smile politely because you're trying to survive socially, and then you would quietly pray for the sweet release of sleep. The wind shifts slightly, and the sail flutters. The crew responds instantly, adjusting lines with smooth coordination. No yelling, no chaos, just practiced motion. It's the kind of teamwork that makes you feel like you've wandered into the wrong group project. If you know that a particular star should be directly above a certain island, then tracking where it sits in the sky can help you judge your north-south position. So if you want to sail to Hawaii, for example, you might pay attention to stars that pass near the zenith of that region. Historians still argue whether ancient Polynesian navigators used zenith stars in the same formalized way modern scholars describe, or whether their system was more intuitive and experience-based. But the concept remains. The sky can tell you where you are if you know how to listen. And out here, the navigator listens like the sky is whispering secrets. You, meanwhile, are trying to remember the difference between Orion and the Big Dipper. It's going great. The navigator begins to gesture toward the horizon again, this time tracing an invisible arc. They're showing the path the star will take as it rises, crosses the sky, and sets. You realize that the navigator isn't thinking in terms of static direction like north and east the way your phone does. They're thinking in motion. They're thinking in journeys. The stars don't just mark points. They mark routes. In some Polynesian traditions, navigators used what could be described as star paths, sequences of stars that could be followed one after another as the night progressed. If one star set, another would rise. The navigator would shift their reference point, maintaining course. It's like following stepping stones across the sky. Only the stepping stones are burning balls of plasma millions of miles away. No big deal. You watch as the navigator's eyes flick from one star to another, occasionally checking the canoe's heading by aligning the bow with a star's rising point. It's subtle, almost invisible, and you start to understand why Polynesian wayfinding is often described as both science and art. Because the knowledge is technical, but the practice is fluid. Because if the sky is the map, the ocean is the message. You decide to do something slightly reckless. You close one eye, then the other, trying to see if your night vision improves. It doesn't. You just look like someone trying to wink at the entire Pacific. But night vision is a real part of the navigator's skill. Human eyes take time to adjust to darkness. The rods in your retina need about 20 to 30 minutes to reach full sensitivity. And you realize something funny. The navigator has been living their whole life in a world where darkness is not an obstacle. It's a tool. They don't fear the night. They use it. A quirky tidbit you might enjoy is that some navigators reportedly avoided looking at bright fires or torches at night because it would ruin their night vision. Imagine being on a canoe and someone lights a torch, and the navigator is like, "Great, now I'm blind. Thanks, Kevin." You chuckle quietly at the thought, then immediately regret it because you don't want to wake anyone. Out here, even laughter feels loud. The navigator's gaze stays steady, scanning in a slow pattern. You start copying them. Horizon, stars, horizon again, sea surface, cloud shapes. You notice that the navigator doesn't dart their eyes around randomly. Their scanning is methodical, almost meditative, like they're reading a book written in invisible ink. And then, as you stare at the horizon, you begin to notice something subtle. The horizon isn't perfectly straight. There's a slight bulge of brightness in one direction, a faint glow. Not enough to call it land, but enough to make you wonder. You point it out quietly, feeling proud of yourself. The navigator glances, then gives a small nod, as if to say, yes, you've noticed something real. But they don't celebrate. They don't clap. They don't say, "Good job, little apprentice." They just continue watching, because the navigator knows the difference between noticing a clue and trusting it. It just lives in your brain as a living map. Historians still argue whether attack, as described by modern researchers, was used universally across Pacific cultures, or whether it was more specific to certain regions like the Caroline Islands. Some scholars believe Western interpretations oversimplified or misunderstood aspects of the system. But even with debate, one thing is clear: These navigators had a sophisticated understanding of wave behavior that modern people rarely think about. Because modern people mostly interact with the ocean by taking selfies near it. You shift slightly, and the canoe responds. The swell lifts you again, but this time you notice something different. There's a second rhythm. A cross-swell. It feels like a gentle bump from the side, arriving at a different interval than the main swell. Subtle, but it's there. The navigator's eyes flick toward the water, and their lips press together slightly, as if confirming the same thing. You realize the ocean is layered. Multiple swell systems can exist at once. One swell might come from a storm far to the northeast. Another might come from trade winds to the southeast. They intersect, overlap, and create a complex texture on the surface. To you, it feels like random rocking. To the navigator, it's information. And the most mind-blowing part is that swells can hint at land. Because when swells encounter an island, they change. They reflect, refract, bend around coastlines, bounce off reefs. This can create patterns in the water that experienced navigators can detect even when the island itself is beyond the horizon. So land affects the ocean before you can see it. It leaves a fingerprint, and the navigator knows how to read it. You stare out at the dark water, trying to imagine an invisible island influencing waves miles away. It feels like something out of a fantasy novel, like the island is casting a spell. But it's physics. It's real. The crew moves quietly, their bodies practiced and efficient. The navigator remains still, their gaze fixed on the clouds. You notice that the air itself feels slightly different now. It's subtle, but there's a faint increase in humidity. The breeze smells less like pure salt and more like something else. You can't name it yet, but it feels heavier, softer. You breathe in slowly. There's a hint of green. Not literal green, obviously, but that plant-like scent that makes you think of leaves, damp earth, and shaded forests. It's faint, almost imaginary, but the navigator notices. You can tell they notice because their nostrils flare slightly, and their head tilts as if they're listening with their whole face. This is another skill of wayfinding, reading the air. Land has smells. Vegetation releases scents. Soil releases moisture. Birds carry traces of forests on their feathers. Even the temperature of the wind can shift near islands. Out here, the ocean air is clean and sharp. Near land, it becomes complex. The navigator is tasting that complexity. Historians still argue whether smell was a primary navigational tool or more of a confirmation cue used once other signs suggested land was near. Some researchers believe smell could travel dozens of miles, while others think it's too unreliable in open ocean. But standing here, breathing this faint hint of greenery, you can believe it's real. You keep watching the horizon. The faint glow beneath the clouds becomes slightly more obvious. It's not bright. It's not like a city skyline. It's more like the darkness has been gently smudged with a lighter charcoal. This could be what some navigators describe as island glow. In certain conditions, shallow lagoons reflect moonlight or starlight upward. That light can bounce off the underside of clouds, creating a subtle brightness that signals land. It's like the ocean is holding a mirror up to the sky. You imagine how this would look to someone trained. You glance toward the horizon again, and the air feels warmer now. You can smell the faint scent of something earthy, like wet leaves after rain. The canoe glides onward, and the crew seems slightly more alert. Some people are awake now, sitting quietly, watching the sky. You can sense a shift in the mood. Land is becoming a possibility. And birds are part of that growing certainty. You wonder how navigators learned all this. How did they know which birds mattered? The answer is observation passed down through generations, and likely trial and error, which is a polite way of saying some people probably got very lost before the knowledge became refined. Historians still argue whether Polynesian navigation relied more heavily on environmental cues like birds and swells than on celestial navigation, especially in cloudy conditions. Some scholars emphasize that birds were crucial in the final stages of finding islands, while others suggest they were more supplementary. But out here, watching these birds cross the night sky, you feel like they're more than supplementary. They're confirmation. They're reassurance. They're the ocean's little whisper that says, "Yes, you're close. Keep going." The navigator watches the horizon, then points again, this time toward a cluster of faint shapes moving low over the water. At first you think they're just shadows. Then you realize they're birds. A small group, flying in a loose formation, heading in the same direction. You feel a little thrill even though you're trying to stay sleepy. It's hard not to be excited when you realize you're watching a living compass. The birds skim the water, their wings catching faint starlight. They move with confidence, like they've done this route 1,000 times. Because they have. And you suddenly understand why this works. Birds don't care about human maps. Birds care about food and home. They follow instinct, and instinct is shaped by geography. So their flight patterns become reliable. And suddenly, the idea of land stops being abstract. It becomes real. The navigator watches the leaf too, then glances at the swells. The swell pattern feels more complex now, less smooth. You can sense a faint bounce in the water, as if waves are reflecting off something ahead. This is another sign of land. Wave reflection and interference caused by reefs and shorelines. The navigator's senses are gathering all these details like threads, weaving them into a picture. You notice the crew stirring again. Someone points quietly toward the horizon. Another person leans forward, squinting. And you realize you're not the only one who can feel the change. Even the canoe feels different now. The air is heavier. The sound of water against the hull has shifted slightly, as if the sea is shallower. The ocean's voice is changing tone. You breathe in again. There's another smell now. Smoke. Very faint, like the ghost of a campfire carried on the wind. Could be distant lightning storms, but it feels human. If there's smoke, there are people. If there are people, there is home. You imagine ancient voyagers catching that smell after weeks at sea, their hearts lifting quietly in their chests. No cheering, no screaming, just a deep, silent relief. Because the ocean is beautiful, but it is not gentle forever. You sit back, letting the canoe rock you, and then you notice something else. The taste of the air. Sounds strange, but you can taste it. The saltiness is less sharp now. There's a faint sweetness in the breeze, like the air has been filtered through leaves. The navigator watches the wind again, then shifts the canoe's heading slightly. You can feel the canoe turn. Subtle, like a slow drift, but it's intentional. The navigator is aligning with the clues. And you think about how much trust is required for this. Because out here, you can't confirm with sight until the very last moment. You can't climb a hill and check. You can't pull up a satellite map. Some scholars believe the distinction is artificial, that in Polynesian societies, practical and spiritual knowledge were intertwined, not separated into neat categories. And sitting here, listening to the soft sounds of the canoe, you can believe that. Because out here, navigation is survival. And survival is sacred. The navigator's eyes lift to the sky again, and you follow their gaze. The stars have shifted further west. Some have set. New ones have risen. And the navigator seems to know exactly what time it is based on that shift. This is another aspect of celestial navigation, timekeeping. You don't have clocks out here, but the sky is a clock. The rising and setting of stars, the movement of constellations, the position of the moon, all of it gives you a sense of time passing. And time matters because it tells you how far you've traveled. If you know your canoe's approximate speed and you know how long you've been sailing in a certain direction, you can estimate distance. Not precisely, perhaps, but well enough to know when you should expect land. This is often called dead reckoning in modern navigation, estimating your position based on speed and direction over time. And Polynesian navigators, in their own way, practiced it too. They tracked direction by stars and swells, tracked time by celestial movement, and built an internal estimate of where they were. Which, again, is terrifyingly impressive. You try to imagine doing this yourself. You'd be like, okay, we've been sailing for some amount of time in a direction and I feel tired. Not exactly reliable. The navigator, though, is calm. Their mind is organized. Their memory is structured. And you realize this isn't just natural talent. It's training. Years of training. Decades of experience. A whole culture supporting the preservation of this knowledge. because navigators weren't just random sailors. They were specialists, highly respected, sometimes even feared because their knowledge gave them power. When you're surrounded by something powerful, you treat it carefully. Historians still argue whether these taboos were primarily spiritual protections or practical social controls designed to keep harmony on long voyages. But the effect is the same: discipline. And discipline keeps you alive. You watch the navigator's face. It's calm, but you can sense their mind working constantly. They are not stressed, but they are engaged. They are holding the entire system in their awareness. Stars, swells, wind, birds, smell, sound. They are like a conductor guiding an orchestra of nature. And the ocean is a very large orchestra. The crew's behavior changes subtly as land approaches. People sit up. They check supplies. They tighten lashings. Someone murmurs a quiet joke, but it's subdued. No one is loud, because this is a sacred moment. Approaching land is not just arrival. It is proof. Proof that the navigator's knowledge still works. Proof that the ancestors' routes are still remembered. Proof that the canoe is more than a boat. You imagine ancient Polynesian voyages, families leaving one island to settle another. They would have carried not just crops and animals, but cultural identity, language, songs, rituals. And the navigator was the one who ensured that identity could travel across water. Without them, islands would remain isolated. Cultures would fragment. Trade would vanish. The navigator is the connective tissue of an ocean civilization. You feel a quiet respect settle over you. And then, because you're still you, you think, wow, that's a lot of responsibility. I can barely keep a houseplant alive. The canoe rocks gently, and you hear the surf more clearly now. The sound is textured, not just a roar. You can hear waves breaking in sets, the hiss of foam, the low boom of water hitting reef. The navigator listens carefully. Sound becomes a map now. They can tell where the reef line is by the sound of breaking waves. Imagine being out here for weeks, salty and sunbaked, rubbing coconut oil on yourself like you're trying to marinate. And you can't help but think, at least your skin would be moisturized. Your dignity would be gone, but your skin would be glowing. The crew continues paddling, and you hear quiet conversation, soft murmurs, jokes exchanged under breath. Not loud laughter, but the kind of humor that keeps people sane. One person gestures toward the horizon and says something that makes another person chuckle. You don't know the words, but you can guess the vibe. Probably something like, next time, let's just stay home. You smile faintly, feeling